So
All
Jason,
right. Go ahead, Charles.
I'm just asking, do you see my sharing page or?
Yep, I'm
Oh,
the screen. Yep.
gotcha. Okay.
Okay. So welcome everybody. We do have a tight schedule today, so I wanted to try to stay as close as possible to that. So what's going to happen today is we do have, oh goodness, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 talks today. And so how I'm going to do this is I'm going to record each one separately, and then I will be sending those out on Monday morning so that you can then watch them at your leisure, or if you leave for lunch or something like that. We do have some breaks, but we don't have a lot of time in between speakers. So what I'll do in between speakers is put everybody in the waiting room, let the speaker in, get it all technical things all worked out, and then we'll let everybody right back in. So you're not actually going anywhere. It's just a thing to help us out so that you don't see, somebody saying they can't figure out this or that, and I can't figure out something. So with that, we're going to start this morning with Dr. Charles Chamberlain, who's doing our base talk about the politics and urban change in New Orleans in the 60s. And so Charles is a professor of public history at UNO. He's been a historian for the Louisiana State Museum. He's a he also works with other museums around the country. And so Charles is just an expert on Louisiana history and politics, and especially New Orleans. So with that, I welcome Dr. Charles Chamberlain.
All right. Thank you, Jason. Can everyone hear me? I hope so. Anyway, Jason will text me if there's any technical problems along the way. But anyway, I wanted to welcome you all to the introductory lecture. He described me as an expert on politics. That is actually not one of my fields of expertise, but after today, I may be considered an expert on politics in the 60s at least. So this is a really exciting era, and I'm just going to go ahead and dive in. Here we have the title page, New Orleans Politics and Urban Change in the 1960s, Straddling the Past and the Future. And so to me, that's what this decade represents, is a real transition between the past and then those that hung on to the past, and then also those who moved on to the future. And Vic Schiro, the mayor during this time period, is really a guy who kind of embodies both of those elements. So just quickly kind of going around the opening screen here, we have a picture of the Riverfront Expressway in the top left, the Spring Fiesta, which up to 1968 was the only festival in New Orleans, which is now the festival capital of the United States, which is hard to believe that was the only festival. In the bottom center, we have a picture of President Kennedy's visit to New Orleans in 1962, and this is when the Lincoln Continental suicide door convertible is driving by, and you can see Jimmy Davis with his black hat and Vic Schiro in his white suit and his white hat driving by, and then there's Kennedy to the far left. And then bottom right is George Wein and Mahalia Jackson and Vic Schiro at the first Jazz Fest in 1970. That really is how we're going to conclude. And then Leah Chase up at the top right, probably in the early 70s. So anyway, here we go. And usually the way I start off, let's see, how do we go from here? Oh, sorry, oops. Okay. So I usually start off by giving people the guests here a list of books or articles that I would recommend for further reading on the subject. So number one at the top is Ed Haas's Mayor Victor Schiro, New Orleans in Transition, 1961 to 1970. So Ed Haas was actually the archivist at the Louisiana State Museum for, I think, most of the 70s and early 80s. He's a very well-respected New Orleans political historian. So he is, in my opinion, the real expert on this time period. And his book on Schiro is definitely worth a read. And then part of that is an article from the Louisiana History Journal, winter 2001, which is The Expedient of Race, Vic Schiro, Scott Wilson, and the New Orleans Mayoralty Campaign of 1962. A few other books I'd recommend are Cindy Dawns Monto's Michoud Assembly Facility, 2014, which is a history of the Michoud Assembly Facility with lots of great pictures. It's a really fun book to read and has lots of useful information about this time period. Kent Germany, who was a colleague of mine from Tulane Graduate School in the 90s. His book, After the Promises, Poverty, Citizenship, and the Search for the Great Society, 2007, really looks at the effects of the Great Society on New Orleans politics in the 1960s. And the Great Society would be Lyndon Johnson's social welfare and political program that started in 1965, and its huge impact on New Orleans. And then Richard O. Baumbach Jr. and William E. Bora's The Second Battle of New Orleans, A History of the Vauquerès Riverfront Expressway Controversy, published 1981, for this huge event, this huge conflict of urban renewal and expressway development. This is the book. And so these are the guys, the lawyers who actually fought against the federal government on the Riverfront Expressway issue. So great insiders read for that. And then lastly, J. Mark Souther, another colleague of mine from the Tulane Graduate School in the 90s. He started out as a tourism expert. And so his book, New Orleans on Parade, Tourism and the Transformation of the Crescent City, really focuses on how New Orleans transformed into a tourism-based economy during this time period. The 1960s is seminal in terms of that. And he does a really great job of exploring all the context and the specifics of that. So I also want to include, there's a Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities, the LEH, had a series of seminars on New Orleans mayors in 2010. And this one is actually broadcast on YouTube. So if you look up this link on YouTube, it has the entire 50-minute seminar. It features Lolis Eli Sr., who is a civil rights attorney, Jack McGuire, who was Skiro's press secretary, and Gasper Skiro, who's his cousin / nephew, and Dave Dixon, the father of the Superdome and the Saints. And it provides a lot of insight. I learned a ton from that. And part of that discussion is going to be the basis for what we're talking about today. And I would say, if you want to kind of get a real feel for the legacy of Dick Skiro, there's an excellent video to watch. It's 50 minutes in length. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to promote that. So here we go on to the lecture itself. And so I want to start off by putting New Orleans in the context of the Sun Belt. And so the term Sun Belt is a term for all of the states of the American Southeast and Southwest that began to really boom after World War II, in part because of the infrastructure development of World War II. I want to compare, especially the population national rank of New Orleans compared to other Southeastern cities at the time, who they felt very competitive with and who they wanted to keep up with, in part because in 1940, New Orleans was still the most populous city of the South. If you see on the statistic there to the far left, in 1940, we had 494 and Houston only had 384. But yet by 1950, Houston had then bypassed New Orleans as the most populous city of the American South. We reached our population peak, as you see, in 1960 at 627, 525,000. We were 15 ranked in the nation. Houston at that time had already jumped up to 9 million. It had basically tripled in size in 20 years. And then you see by 1970, New Orleans actually lost population, in part because of white flight. We'll look at some of those statistics later. So Houston had already passed 1 million by that time, and it jumped to number 6. New Orleans had dropped to number 19. Some of our other competitors, Dallas had jumped to number 8. Memphis had jumped to number 17. So we were losing in this overall Sun Belt race. And part of that was because these other cities had room to expand in terms of geography. The size of their counties and the metropolitan areas were able to grow. New Orleans, constricted by Orleans Parish, was not able to grow. And we're going to talk about this overall effect. But I think it's very important to see that Skiro, especially in the 1960s, was very cognizant of this competition. He did his best to keep up with these other very rapidly growing cities, and we'll see where we landed in the end. So here's more context: the shifting political landscape context of 1960 to 1970. First of all, it's important to point out that the Democrats were in power at all three levels: national, state, and local. So Kennedy and Johnson were the presidents all the way, as you know, from 1960 to 1968. We had Congressman Eddie Hebert representing the Congressional District of New Orleans, and also Hale Boggs, same thing. And then Jimmy Davis and John McKiffin, the governors, were Democrats. Vic Skiro was the mayor for most of this time. And so I do want to point out that it's very important the alignment of this party and all three levels led to what I would describe as a combination of pork politics and power, and that New Orleans did receive some federal largesse because of these connections. And that includes, just roughly speaking, both Michoud and help from Betsy. And then it's also a transition from the old Democrats to the new Democrats, the transition of the Democratic Party overall. And so Shep Morrison, mayor from 46 to 61, and then Vic Skiro from 61 to 70. And so they were both considered political reformers in terms of being anti-Long. They were also both racial segregationists. That's where they saw their bread and butter support. And yet at the same time, they were also economic modernists in that they wanted to grow the New Orleans economy in an international context, and especially competing with these other Sunbelt cities. And then meanwhile, you have the rise of New Democrats, the burgeoning civil rights movement. And this is framed by school desegregation in 1960, and then the protests and sit-ins from 1960 to 65. And then this is also in the context of, again, this transition in the Democratic Party of new national policy in the Kennedy-Johnson era, a shift from the Democratic Party of segregation, which was the party of the Old South, to civil rights, which is kind of the party of the modern South. And this is the shift is reflected in the Democratic support of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed all forms of discrimination, and then the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which basically outlawed all forms of voter disfranchisement. And so Johnson, as a Democratic president, oversaw the passage of both of those, which is part of the legacy of the modern Democratic Party. And also Johnson's Great Society, 1968. And here we have this picture, again, of Kennedy's visit in 1962. And there's Jimmy Davis in the middle as governor, segregationist, and Vic Skiro on the far right, also a segregationist at the time. And Kennedy had to basically work around this issue of trying to balance civil rights and segregation in the South. So here's a great picture of Kennedy's visit. This is actually when they were initiating the Nashville Wharf on the Mississippi Riverfront in 1962. You can see a huge crowd turned out. And at the same time, this is the time when white Southern conservatives saw Kennedy as an enemy of segregation. So this is a very interesting transitional time, but a great shot of the Lincoln Continental convertible. Hold on just a sec, let me see. I'm not sure why that didn't show. Gosh. Let's see. Okay, sorry. So here we have the end of the Morrison era, 1946 to 61. So Morrison, as governor up until the middle of 61, he was considered a 1950s economic modernist. So he built the new city hall, the new airport, the Gino Bridge, the new train station, which consolidated all of the different train lines, and also suburban growth on the lakefront. And I should also add Algiers. So he was elected in 46 initially after World War II as a reformer from basically the old regulars and the Longites. And so he was reelected in 50, 54, and 58. So back when you could run for 4 consecutive terms in New Orleans, they changed the law after his mayorship. And so as a segregationist in 1960 for school desegregation, he really didn't do much to keep the protests, the conservative protest crowds at bay. And so the national media played up on this. They illuminated the white resistance, creating an image debacle for the city. And on top of that, as a segregationist, he promoted the idea of Pontchartrain Park, which at the time was considered a modern African-American suburb on the lakefront, basically to open up kind of modern ranch-style suburban housing to African-American professionals and middle-class people. And then also public housing remained segregated, and that went on down the line to the recreational department, civil service, public transportation, all remained segregated under him despite all the civil rights activity. So did he achieve political reform as he claimed? What political groups supported him by 1960? Well, he was a member of the Crescent City Democratic Organization, who were considered the anti-long opponents of the pro-long old regulars. For example, Mayor Maestri, his predecessor, was a member of the old regulars. And so as a member of the CCDO, it automatically qualified him as a reformer. I did add a book cover for the book Silk Stockings and Ballot Boxes by Pamela Tyler. So if y'all are looking for more historical information on this subject, it's really the premier book on opponents to Mayor Shep Morrison in terms of viewing him as corrupt. And so this is where reform-minded women in New Orleans opposed his mayorship because they saw him as a corrupt. And I would recommend that book in a heartbeat. It's really about women's enfranchisement from 1920 to 1965. So at the same time, Morrison ran unsuccessful campaigns for governor in 56 and 60. Essentially, he was too urban and Catholic for all of Louisiana. He resigns in 1961, appointed by JFK as ambassador of the OAS, the Organization of American States. And part of that, I think, is because as mayor in New Orleans, he advertised New Orleans as the gateway to the Americas, especially for Latin American trade. So that was kind of one of his legacies, is he really encouraged trade with Latin America. So now we move on to school seat desegregation in the fall of 1960. There is a video that I got from YouTube, which shows the protests and the process of desegregation. I'm not going to play that, but the overall legacy is that there was a national spotlight on New Orleans' troubled desegregation process. And as I mentioned, Morrison basically enabled that by keeping NOPD only one block away from the schools. And so the national media played up on all of these protests. It has been argued by Jack McGuire, Skiro's press secretary, that the city, for whatever reason, chose to desegregate the lower Ninth Ward, on the upper Ninth Ward, and on the edge of St. Bernard Parish, and then thereby allow the St. Bernard Parish mothers to come in and protest. It was actually more liberal uptown schools that had asked to be desegregated first, but for whatever reason, Morrison wanted to desegregate the Ninth Ward first. And then on the right, what I'd like to point out is Ruby Bridges, who is pictured as a child in the bottom right picture, often gets most of the publicity for the 4 young ladies in kindergarten who desegregated these elementary schools. The picture on the top right shows the 3 others, and that is Leona Tate, who has her Leona Tate Foundation, which she wants to start a museum at the former McDonough 19 on St. Claude, to basically be a museum of tolerance and change, and also tell the history of the story. And then her other colleagues, Gail Etienne and Tessie Prevost, who get less publicity. But today, Leona Tate actually runs the Lower Ninth Ward Living History Museum, which is a great museum. I would encourage you all to go check it out anytime you want. To me, that's the real legacy of this, is these ladies today that try to carry on the legacy of what they've done. And they're realistic about it. Leona, I've met her many times. She says, even though they integrated, it was still a separate world. And she says, even when they went to Beauregard High School, they still had their separate white and black proms, et cetera, et cetera. And she just is basically trying to raise awareness for tolerance and acceptance overall. So it's very important to recognize that. Oh gosh, let's see, move on down. So Mayor Vic Skiro, in terms of a mixed racial legacy from 1961 to 1970, his motto overall was, and Jack McGuire says this, if it's good for New Orleans, I'm for it. And so that's a great motto, but you have to question, how is good defined and for whom? And what is the irony is that he comes from an Italian, Greek, Albanian ancestry. He faced some discrimination himself. And this comes from Jack McGuire, who said that he had a conversation with the editor of one of New Orleans' top papers at the time, who felt that any Italian American should never be above a council member. So he did not respect or want to help Vic Schiro as a mayor at the time. And yet Vic Schiro saw his political future buttressed by being a segregationist. And so his political fortunes were tied to racial conservatism, and he won the election in January 1962 with 58% of the vote, which is a pretty clear majority. But that's after his attacks of a racial moderate in the Democratic primary against opponent Adrien Duplanche. And at that time, he barely squeaked through. So in the final election against a Republican, he won 58. In the initial Democratic primary, which is really kind of the main test at that time, he barely squeaked through. And so Schiro only received 3% of the Black vote in 1962, which is very interesting, telling of African Americans' view on him and his politics. But this is also in the context of how the business community in New Orleans realized the need for a racially moderate approach in comparison to these other very rapidly growing southern cities like Houston, Dallas, and Atlanta, all these other Sunbelt cities, where honestly, all three of those, their leadership made an attempt to try to create the peace. And this is, again, in the context of what's going on in Birmingham, for example, where conservative reactionaries are creating violence, leading to situations where if you're in business, it's not a healthy environment for investing or wanting to move to that area. So local business people in New Orleans generally wanted New Orleans to remain calm. And I will say overall that in the Schiro period, New Orleans does have a sense of racial calm overall. So in 1965, he's reelected with, again, 50.1% of the vote. That's a squeaker. That's before the Voting Rights Act had a big impact on New Orleans voting. And Lolis Eli Sr. in that LEH 50-minute seminar, he said, initially, I did not want to come to the seminar because I had to have several meetings with Schiro. I thought he was a complete racist. And he claims that African Americans supported Schiro to avoid 2 terms in a row of Jimmy Fitzmaurice, who they saw as more of the same. And so kind of in the big picture is once Schiro's term is over, then you have Moon Landrieu come in 1970, and he's the one that really initiates more racial change than Schiro was willing to allow, and probably more than Fitzmaurice was willing to allow. And the picture to the right is Avery Alexander being dragged out of City Hall in his August 1963 protest. And so here's a picture of Avery Alexander being removed from City Hall for protesting the cafeteria, which was privately run. And Vic Schiro claims that he had no control over a cafeteria with a contract with the city. And so this is the time in 1963 when there was a march on City Hall. And so Avery Alexander was considered the main civil rights activist from the uptown area who was pushing for desegregation. And on the right is the statue of Avery Alexander, which used to be in Duncan Plaza, and then was moved to the new University Medical Center when it was built. And so kind of concluding, and this really touches more on what Dr. Charlene Senegal is going to talk about in terms of civil rights. Schiro's understated integration is what I would call it. And so I think his strategy overall was to avoid public conflicts that could provide a reputation for a hostile economic climate, as I said. So as interim mayor in 1961, he actually did fully integrate public schools peacefully, and I have that in quotes, in part because he required the NOPD and the federal marshals to keep white protest crowds 4 blocks away, which is a big change from Morrison, who I said allowed the crowds to be 1 block away. So this is really kind of a big difference. So in the end, I think this leads to a lot of white flight, as a lot of white parents then, when schools are integrated, then move to Jefferson Parish. But at the same time, he integrated Delgado Trade School without publicity in 1963, desegregated public facilities and City Hall without publicity in August 1963, initiated a few white collar jobs. In the LEH lecture, Jack McGuire argues that he provided numerous white collar jobs, and most of the historians today say that there were actually 3 white collar jobs open to African Americans. And then when, again, Mayor Landrieu came in 1970, he opened up much more. And also, Skiro closed the public schools rather than integrate them in 1962 to 1969. And finally, in 1969, they reopened the public pools under Nord and integrated them. But kind of most importantly, I think, reflecting Skiro's passive racism is that the Canal Street sit-ins continued until the fall of 1965. And this is after, well after the Civil Rights Act had passed in 1964, outlawing discrimination. So I think the fact that Skiro failed to influence businesses really colors the opinions of people like Lola Sealy Sr., who really held Skiro accountable for not doing enough to desegregate or integrate New Orleans. And so these pictures here on the left is, as you see, City Hall when it was first built, before Duncan Plaza was actually initiated, and that was probably opened in 1954. And then on the right, we have a Canal Street sit-in. So there's a great video by Jules Kahn, who the Historic New Orleans collection has the Jules Kahn collection. And in 1969, June 1969, he documented the integration of Audubon Park Pool. And I'm going to go ahead and play for you this because it shows you Skiro cutting the tape and then the crowds joining in. So I hope y'all enjoy this. This is kind of a fun moment. 1969, but there's Skiro in the middle. There's no sound. And that was back when Audubon Park Pool had a huge public Olympic-sized pool. And then they had a second line. I love the outfits here. Dancing. This is a short video, but for those of you all who do not know Jules Kahn, he was a local guy who was one of the first to kind of document the process of desegregation, and also Mardi Gras Indians, and a lot of very important Black street culture in the 1960s. Hold on, I'm trying to get out of here. Escape. Okay. All right. Oops. Okay, so here we have, based on this process of desegregation, of course, you can't ignore the white flight from Orleans Parish. So here's some statistics about how that affects New Orleans in general. So we reach our peak as a city population in 1960 with 627,000. Meanwhile, Jefferson Parish has already started to grow. It doubles in size from 40 to 50, from 50 to 60, continues to grow to 70 to 80, and then actually starts to lose population in 90 in part because of that. And then, as you notice, St. Bernard is really not all that big. I think from a demographic point of view, a lot of white immigrants, especially Italians from the lower 8th and 9th wards, the downtown area began moving to St. Bernard, probably in the 1960s. And then St. Tammany in 60 and 70 begins to pick up, I think, a lot of growth from Jefferson Parish at the same time. So this is just reflecting, again, the overall growth of the metropolitan area. And then at the same time, the loss of population in New Orleans. And you see the pictures across the top. Top left is veterans at Causeway around 1960. The second to the right, again, is that intersection around 1960 looking south. There's Lakeview Mall when it first opened, and then the Causeway that first opened in the late 50s. And I'm going to kind of move on at a brisk pace from here. I have about 15 minutes left. So ski rose promotion in the International City of New Orleans in 1963. So this is an honorary proclamation to people who were honorary citizens. But it's interesting, on this proclamation, they advertise all the great things about New Orleans in terms of an international city. And so that includes the new city hall, the new airport on the left, the downtown silhouette in the middle, the International House and Trademark, the nation's second port, the Vauqueray and the Sugar Bowl. I mean, that was what they were bragging about. So my question is, how did Skiro modernize New Orleans? Well, going down the list quickly, in 1961, he lobbied NASA to operate a Michoud facility, supported plans for a new airport in New Orleans East, which of course never happened. Eventually moved it into an island out in Lake Pontchartrain in Jefferson Parish, obviously never happened. So from 1962 forward, he supported I-10 construction and growth in New Orleans East. 1964, modernization of police and traffic court facilities. 1965, widening of Poydras Corridor, enabling the growth of new office building corridor and sports arena. 1966, plan for a dome stadium, which became the Superdome. 66, also the NFL team, the Saints. In 1962, plan for the National Jazz Festival. So starting with NASA and Michoud, basically this happened in 1961. So to me, it represents important Sunbelt growth with the corporations of Chrysler and Boeing in terms of Kennedy's landing a man on the moon agenda. So basically what happened was Michoud employed 5,000 plus federal jobs in the East. And this is also with Hale Boggs and Eddie Hebert's help. And so Hale Boggs on the left in that picture with his wife, Lindy, when he was in the House. And then also Eddie Hebert with Werner von Braun, the top rocket scientist for NASA, who was basically the overseer of the V2 rocket project for the Nazis during World War II. And then my favorite picture here down the left of basically the Plymouth station wagon escorting the Saturn rocket in 1962. So this is really important for growth of New Orleans East in 1962. Also the satellite photo of Michoud showing the kind of the impact on the area. But what did it have to do with Skiro? So Skiro actually, as interim mayor, really pushed for the NASA presence at Michoud. So what he did was he created the NASA New Orleans Coordinating Committee, depicted on the bottom right, and they were successful in basically convincing NASA that Michoud was appropriate for their Saturn rocket production facility. And then the left picture shows Werner von Braun presenting a model of the Saturn rocket to Skiro. Really funny picture. I'm not going to comment on it. You can have your own caption. But that brings us to New Orleans East. The modern suburbia comes to New Orleans Parish. So at the time in the 60s, New Orleans East was considered the city of the future. And especially in the bottom right, you see all these big plans for developing all the way out to Irish Bayou. And what it comes down to is that New Orleans East has lots of land that was available for development. 20 minutes to downtown, as the billboard says. It's residential, commercial, industrial. It's got it all, right? So it's really a symbol of this Sunbelt growth and hope for New Orleans competing against these other cities. The reality is that The far east part becomes Bayou Sauvage National Wildlife Refuge. And especially on the left here, we see those two planned interchanges that are now the exits to nowhere. When you're headed out past Michoud exit, you'll see those exits go to nowhere. And so part of that is the fact that the Murchison Wind Company, who owned those, basically went bankrupt and then sold it to Merrill Lynch. And then Merrill Lynch donated it to the US government to be Bayou Sauvage National Wildlife Refuge. There's a satellite picture, or excuse me, an aerial picture of that area to the right, top right. And then at the bottom right, you see the Congress Inn. The reason I point the Congress Inn really has more to do with Bruce Spizer's lecture. And that is when the Beatles came in 1964 on their tour, they were supposed to stay at the Monteleone. And then the manager said, there's no way that we're going to be able to keep away all these crazy teenagers. So the Beatles stayed way out on Chef Highway, just east of modern day 310 Paris Road, at what was the Congress Inn at that time. And sure enough, teenagers found out about it, invaded that area. The Beatles' dreams of exploring the French Quarter were dashed. And probably Bruce will tell us more about that. So anyway, we're going to run quickly through some various aspects of New Orleans modernization. So that includes the Canal Street streetcar line, replaced with bus line in 1964, May 1964. Again, that was reopened as a streetcar line in 2004 after a bunch of lobbying. And so that was considered progress, replacing a streetcar with a bus at the time. Streetcars were considered old-fashioned Victorian, so Skid Row replaced that. New housing developments. So we have Melpomene and the Gust housing project in the uptown Central City area. The Melpomene was largely torn down after Katrina and replaced with modern kind of single or duplex style housing. The Gust senior housing high rise still exists. And then the Fisher on the right was also torn down after Katrina on the West Bank in Algiers. But those were considered modern public housing, especially for African Americans at the time in those regions. And that brings us to the construction of the new New Orleans Police Department and Traffic Headquarters and the demolition of Louis Armstrong's birthplace, Jane Alley, in 1964. So there's a picture of a bulldozer tearing this area down. Here's a picture of Louis Armstrong visiting in the 1950s, his birthplace, essentially, at the site of the modern police headquarters. Love the fact that he's stirring the laundry in the laundry wash pot. And then here's the picture of the modern New Orleans traffic court and police headquarters. And I will say at the time that jazz preservationists in 1964 and 65 opposed this, and they basically lobbied to City Hall that this should not go on to preserve Louis Armstrong's legacy in the city. And under Skid Row, this didn't matter. Skid Row was focused on modernization. And they also tore down the colored waifs home where Louis Armstrong basically was sentenced to in his early teen years, and where he learned his first formal musical training. So on the picture on the right, you see the arrow pointing to a young Louis Armstrong where he's learned his first formal musical training. And then on the left, October 1964, the city had torn that down. You can see the date on the picture at the top. And for many Armstrong historians, and I especially have talked to so many tourists over the years, where can I find remnants of Armstrong's youth? And I have to tell them that his childhood home was torn down to make way for City Hall in Lincoln Plaza. His birthplace and his schooling place were torn down in the mid-1960s to make way for the traffic court and traffic administration facilities. So I asked the question always, was this a tourism opportunity overlooked? But in 1965, that was not even a consideration. They held no political weight to the city. So there's a picture of the colored waifs home at the time, and Armstrong with his two mentors, Peter Davis and Captain Jones of the Colors Waifs home. This is the place today, basically the Traffic Administration Center on City Boulevard. And after Katrina, it's been abandoned. So to me, unfortunately, I view it as a complete waste But given the context of the time, Skiro thought it was a process of modernization. So there's nothing we can do about it now, other than promote them as sites for people to visit if they're looking for Louis Armstrong history. So then the irony is, in 1965, Armstrong came back to the city on a post-segregation homecoming. And this is where he met with Clay Shaw and Helen Arlt and Myra Menville of the Jazz Club. And he was given the key to the city. And I love this picture right here. This is October 1965, just months after the Bloody Sunday event in Selma, where Alabama state troopers beat down John Lewis and the marchers. And here is a Louisiana state trooper opening a beer for Louis Armstrong in a gesture of kindness. And so to me, that says a lot about kind of the state of what New Orleans wanted to represent at that time. And then at the same time, and this goes back to Bruce Spicer, in 1964, Armstrong's Hello Dolly displaces Can't Buy Me Love as the #1 song on the Billboard Top 100. And so to me, it's quite phenomenal that after the Beatles had held all of these records for #1 songs, and then you hear this 64-year-old man producing a jazz song, which becomes #1. And then when the Beatles came in 1964, in the bottom right, you see who do they want to meet but Fats Domino. So the Beatles were cool. Armstrong was glad to receive his first Grammy for that single. And so we have to move quickly now. And Craig Colton's going to talk more about this, but part of the legacy of Betsy is the Flood Control Act of 1965, which produces our 15-foot levee protection for $56 million, the National Flood Insurance Program, with the help of Skiro Boggs and Senator Russell Long, who have a political ally in President Johnson and the White House, who came down to visit New Orleans at the time. And this provides our flood protection to today. Now, in terms of the modernization of New Orleans, we have the widening of Poydras Street from 65 to 66, which allows for the creation of all these modern skyscrapers, which create the Poydras corridor today. In the middle picture, especially, you see the International Trade Mart being built around 1966. So completed in 1966, Skiro called it the new Park Avenue of the South. And you can see the difference it made in these pictures. There's the Hotel de Soto, for example, that had to lop off the entire front and then create Le Pavillon by the 1970s. You have Meili's Table d'Hôtes restaurant, and it started in 1876, it survives, it closes in 1986. It's today the Copper Vine wine bar. So Lower Canal Street demolition and repurposing, 1965 to 68. The removal of the L&N, the Louisville and Nashville Railroad Depot. The clearing of the blocks from South Peters and Fulton between Canal and Poydras to create basically the Rivergate Convention Center of 1968, basically designed by Curtis and Davis, Nathaniel C. Curtis and Arthur Quentin Davis, the father of Quint Davis of Jazz Fest. And so this is considered a very important modern building after World War II that was torn down to make way for Harrah's. And so that was a very controversial moment in New Orleans history. So in terms of New Orleans high rises, this is also when we see the birth of the high rise, the Rout Center built by Joseph Rout in 67, the Plaza Tower featured here, opened in 68, the International Trade Mart featured on the bottom right, which is now the Four Seasons, and the One Shell Square, which was completed in 1972, but began in 1970 in Vic Skiro's last year as mayor. But I would argue that Skiro initiated this surge in modern development. So we also have the top of the Mart. Some of y'all probably remember the world's largest revolving lounge on top of the world, the International Trade Mart. And then we have these comparative pictures of the bottom of Canal Street, and I'll just show you back and forth the changes that occur with the World Trade Center going back, to before, and then there's the World Trade Center. So big change with the Rivergate and the World Trade Center in 1968 and 70. And then, so Skiro promise number one is the multi-purpose stadium, the Superdome. You can see the area they cleared there. You can see the Shell Square being built in the background. Again, built by Curtis and Davis with political support from McKithen and Dave Dixon. There's a picture of it, aerial picture. Skiro's promise number two, according to Jack McGuire, is an NFL franchise, the Saints, which came in 1966. And then, ironically, Dave Dixon initiates the first integrated sports event in the South in the fall of 1965. And this is after the hospitality test for New Orleans of the AFL All-Star Game. So at that time, NFL and AFL were two separate leagues. AFL had their All-Star Game in January 1965. However, the black players just suffered such discrimination that they basically had a strike, and then the game was moved, as you see, to the program for the right to Houston based on this strike. And so there's a wake-up call for New Orleans to say that you are not ready for an integrated event. And then the interstate comes to New Orleans. So modern expressways in progress. And so as you see in the chart on the bottom right, the expressway is supposed to go across the top of Lakeview and then down into the city. And then here's the map of how the expressway is supposed to come across the front of the city or across the riverfront and up Elysian Fields. And New Orleans was the first city to say no to the federal government in terms of their plan. And this is based on a Robert Moses 1947 plan for a riverfront expressway. And here's an artist's rendition of the G&O Bridge and Exchange. And the picture to the right shows modern day Louisville, Kentucky, which is considered a poster child of what not to do, what could have happened to New Orleans in terms of a riverfront expressway. So this is what is called the Second Battle of New Orleans. So preservationists mobilized during the 1960s, led by Martha G. Robinson, an uptown socialite, and William E. Borah, an attorney, who had the great quote, "We all know that eternal vigilance is the price we must pay for democracy." I'm gonna go ahead and show this anyway. So here's a depiction of traffic on the proposed Riverfront Expressway. And finally, the kind of the breakdown is there's this city establishment versus the preservationists, and that includes Skiro and Labor and Construction and the Federal Department of Transportation versus Martha Robinson, a preservationist from Uptown, Bill Borah and Dick Bumbach and the VC Pora. So Bill Borah's big quote, which I think is important, is when we fought the highway, what we were really doing was challenging the way things were done, the way power structure worked. We knew the issue was key to the New Orleans future. We set an example for the rest of the country, but it was not what the business and political elite wanted. And I would add that Bill Borah is right in that their impact had a huge impact on the country because what they did really set an example for the rest of the nation. And then the project was canceled by the Nixon administration in 1969. And the two pictures on the right show the San Francisco Embarcadero and also the waterfront in Portland, where these are two bad examples that were promoted as what not to do. And so New Orleans looked at those and said, yes, we will not do that. So I would also offer that Claiborne Avenue and I-10, despite the connections of Tremaine's African-American preservationists, lacked enough political power in 1965 to stop it. And so that is essentially Dookie Chase and Leah Chase had held a lot of political meetings in the 1960s. If you look at the bottom picture, that center picture of Dookie Chase in the 1960s or 50s, that room to the left is where a lot of very important political meetings were held with Mayor Morrison and civil rights activists. So they had connections, but they didn't have enough connections to stop I-10 being built along Claiborne Avenue. And as you saw in one of those earlier diagrams, I-10 had always meant to go along Claiborne Avenue. It's just that the preservationists were able to stop it along the Riverfront Expressway. And so these pictures show the before and after of the beautiful live oaks along Claiborne Avenue and then the way the expressway affected it. And then at the time, this is the way it looked, the beautiful live oaks The Vauqueré Courier says move over trees, hello freeway. And then you see the effect of the freeway. And then on the top right, I would say there is the process of freeway removal, where people have proposed the idea of freeway removal along Claiborne Avenue. That it's still a proposal. We'll see if it happens or not. And then also I would say Martha G. Robinson was also appointed to the Commission for the Preservation of Chalmette Battlefield. And at the time, she advocated the destruction of Fossonville, which is a Black community on the battlefield, and they removed it to create the modern Chalmette Battlefield, which you see at the top right. And that's a picture of the Louisiana State Museum staff and Martha G. Robinson at the time. So quickly, a few other events to happen during this time period was the integration of Mardi Gras, which includes Rex having the St. Augustine Marching 100 join them as a major marching band. That's a big development. Nowadays, all major parades have large high schools join them in terms of their parade. Before 1965 was mostly small marching bands. So the St. Aug Marching 100 was one of the first big bands to join. And then also in 1969, Zulu joined Rex on St. Charles Avenue. And this is the formation of modern Mardi Gras. So also at the same time, Disneyland opens New Orleans Square, dedicated in 1966. And this is basically a recreated, idealized version of the French Quarter. And so the picture on the left shows Walt Disney with Vic Scarrow initiating New Orleans Square. And he joked, oh, New Orleans Square is so much cleaner than the French Quarter. But what I would like to add is that the New Orleans inspired Walt Disney and New Orleans Square. Many of the rides, including the Haunted Mansion, the Mark Twain Riverboat, the Pirates of the Caribbean, were all inspired by New Orleans. And this in turn, especially Mark Souther makes this point, inspired the so-called Disneyfication of the Vauqueré, where that business and commerce leaders saw that the French Quarter had the potential to become like a Disneyland for tourists. And then at the same time, Disneyland created what they call Dixieland at Disneyland, which is like a jazz fest at Disneyland, popular adult event, whereas most of Disneyland is viewed as kind of a kid's place. In the initial 1960s promotion, they were really trying to get adults to come as well. So they included Louis Armstrong coming in 1968, as you see on the right, to play this event. But this brings up Skid Row promise number 3, and that is the idea of a New Orleans Jazz Festival. And then Dave Thomas is obviously going to talk more about this later. So it's viewed as a way to increase tourism. Again, Spring Fiesta was the only festival in the city. They approached producer George Wein, who was the producer of the Newport Jazz and Folk Festivals. He declined. He came down to New Orleans in the 1960s. His wife was African-American. They couldn't stay at the same hotel. He said, y'all are not ready. And then the AFL All-Star Game strike of 1965 was a wake-up call for the city. So after 65, I think the city and the business and the hospitality community really woke up. So by 1968, we hosted the International Jazz Festival of 68 and 69, produced by Tommy Walker, who was the producer of Disneyland's Dixieland Jazz Fest. It's again considered the precursor to today's Jazz Fest in 1970. And I would argue that initiated the modern festival and tourist boom. So that brings us to the final component of today's lecture. And I'm sorry, I'm running over time a little bit. That is the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival, New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Foundation, 1970. The festival, this new festival in 1970 presented a new, inclusive, post-segregation tourist experience in an image of New Orleans internationally. It was a racially integrated foundation board, which was new for New Orleans, and therefore became a symbol of interracial cooperation, albeit some contention and conflict in the 1970s. I mean, any board is going to have its internal squabbles. George Wein's participation, however, reflected a coming of age of New Orleans business and tourism. So again, we've moved beyond the 1965 AFL boycott to a point where we could actually host the festival like this. So the racially integrated celebration of Louisiana food and culture, African American street parade traditions, which includes Mardi Gras Indians and brass bands, was quite unique and still remains unique in terms of festival culture. And I would argue that it ushered in the modern festival culture and tourism, where we just no longer a spring festival. And so there's a great video hosted by the Jazz and Heritage Foundation where it shows Mahalia Jackson with Mayor Skiro in his last week of office in April 1970, hyping the Jazz Fest. And I see we only have, I'm over time. We only have 5 minutes left until the last speaker. So I'm going to move on, but I encourage you all to watch this video. It's great. I love Mahalia. She's the hype lady for the Jazz Fest, and she gets very animated. Oops. Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to go that, but anyway, just to conclude, so the Skiro legacy, 1960 to 1970, I asked the question, did he transition the city to a modern Sunbelt city? So racial politics, he ushered in a new era of post-segregation in terms of business and tourism. And you have to admit, a lot had changed from 1960 to 1970. Compared to Moon Landrieu, however, Skiro is viewed as a passive racist. And especially because Landrieu passed anti-discrimination laws, formed a race relations committee, and he opened up city hall, jobs, and government to African Americans, much more so than Skiro. In terms of tourism, Skiro must be given a lot of credit, I think. He integrated Mardi Gras, he helped create the Superdome, the Saints, the Jazz Fest, all important to modern tourism economy. At the same time, Landrieu courted the modern Canal Street and CBD hotels for a new era of mass tourism, which include all the major hotels, Marriott, Sheraton, Hilton, Holiday Inn. In terms of the economy, Skiro laid the base for, I believe, modernization to help usher in a period of petroleum and energy and job growth. New Orleans emerges as the Gulf Coast deep water oil production center in the 1960s to 1990s. Post-Katrina, of course, there's energy job losses. And Poydras Street building boom, gosh, I mean, high rises just completely mushroom. Mostly multi-international energy companies, Shell, Texaco, Amoco, Mobil, Louisiana Land and Exploration, Freeport during the 1960s and 70s. See the picture to the right. And then in terms of competition with other Sunbelt cities, Houston, Atlanta, Dallas, Memphis, how do we compare? I would say in conclusion that unfortunately, because of our limitations, we suffer from population decline. And now we are limited largely to a tourism economy. Some would argue that our economy is more diverse than ever. But I would give Skiro some credit in terms of laying the groundwork for all of these changes. And I would just conclude by saying that the 1960s in general is, of course, a time of massive transformation for the city. New Orleans in general under Skiro wants to look to the future. At the same time, based on the Disneyland model, they also realize that the past has some gold. So with that, I will conclude. I'm sorry if I've gone on. We have a couple minutes left until the next speaker. So if anyone has any questions, I'll be glad to answer them.
We have just a minute or two. If you do have questions, that was a great, as Tamara Carboni says, an extraordinary capsule history of the period, Charles. So really a great talk. I was going to put everybody in the waiting room, but I think we're going to go straight to Dr. Senegal. So thank you, Charles. We appreciate it. And now that you've set the base for us, we're going to kind of get into the nuts and bolts of what happened in the 60s and much more specific on specific topics. So Charles, can you unshare your screen? And
Yes.
Dr. Senegal, do you mind sharing your screen, and then we'll just get started. And there she is. Perfect. I'm going to pause the recording and then re-record.